So today we're just going to talk about what buttons we have on the camera. So, starting with this camera, this is a D7000. You either have a D7000 or a D7100. There might even be one D7200, but I'm pretty sure they're all 7000s or 7100s. So on any Nikon and most cameras, you're going to have some pretty standard features, but I'm also going to show you just specifically what's on this camera. So the first feature on most any camera, but especially the Nikon, is your shutter release button. And that's this guy up here. Now your shutter release button has an on and off switch, and you just control that obviously by rotating it on or off. And then you can actually rotate it farther and it'll create kind of a green backlight that's nice in dark situations. Then on the top as well, this actually controls when you take a picture. So if you turn it on, and then if I hold this down, there you go. So that takes a picture. That releases the shutter, and that's what gives us that satisfying picture sound. On the front, you have a dial as well. That dial corresponds with a dial on the back. And both of those dials, when you're in manual or aperture or shutter priority, those control the different numbers that you're trying to reach. And we'll talk a lot more about that in class. But basically, if you rotate those while you're in manual, aperture, or shutter, you're going to change some numbers which create exposure. So again, we'll practice with that. Then on the front of the camera, you have a function button, and we don't usually do that too often, but you can actually create different functions for your camera. And then you also have a focal assist light. It's an autofocus assist light. That's great, but oftentimes in assemblies or in dark situations, you might actually want to turn that off. So that's just something to be aware of. It's there. If you ever see a big kind of bright flash and you're like, oh, I didn't want that, that's what that light is. Over on the other side of the camera, we have an IR remote trigger. So that's if you're using an infrared remote to release your shutter. That's what that is for. It senses it there. You have the branding there. Then below there, you have this little button. And if you hold this down and then rotate your lens will come off. Now, generally, you don't need to do that. You guys only have one kind of lens, which is a lens with a kind of a minor focal range. It's generally like a wide angle lens, a general lens. We will have telephoto lenses should you want to use those when we get back to school. They're just very expensive, and I only had 6 of them, so I didn't want to give one to some people and not to others. So hopefully we'll be able to use those at some point this year. Below that, you have a lever that changes from autofocus to manual. So that's for your focusing with your lens, autofocus or manual. Make sure it's rotated to autofocus to start the year. We'll talk about why you might switch it to manual later. On that, if you actually hold down, it's actually also a button, and if you hold that down, you can change the metering areas, the autofocus areas. And again, in the future, that becomes a lot more critical, especially if you're shooting sports. That's something you might want to change. All right, so let's move over to this dial on the side. This is the other one you're going to use a lot. Now you can see on the top of this dial, it has a whole bunch of different elements. Many of you are going to want to start in auto. Auto is just your basic thing. It's going to do everything for you. It's going to try to use its programming to guess what the exposure is and how that works. Then you can go to P, which is program. And so basically it's also auto, but it just gives you kind of a little bit more user interface. But it's, again, pretty much auto. You're not going to use that a ton, but you might use it to start the year. Then the ones you're going to definitely use are S, which is shutter priority, and A, which is aperture priority. Those are basically setting, you're saying I want to set my shutter and I want the computer to figure out the aperture. Or I'm going to set my aperture and I want the computer to figure out the shutter speed. And again, in class we'll talk about why you would choose that. Then you have manual mode, which is the M, and that manual mode is going to give you the opportunity to basically control everything you want to. So that's what you're going to shoot a lot of things with toward the end of the year, but at the beginning of the year, I understand if you're not quite there yet. Then you have user 2 and user 1, which are different user settings you can set. So you can set things in case, for instance, you're always shooting sports and you're like, I want to make sure my camera can quickly turn to my sports setting. You could set your user 1 or user 2. Then you have like scenes, and those are, again, kind of computer generated scenes. So again, it'll be like night photography, and it would try to guess what it should be. So I'm gonna leave mine as I always do, just on manual. Then at the back, you have a dial that's below that, and it has an S, a CL, CH, Q, a little clock looking thing, and then what's a remote, and then an M up. So what you're gonna use is S here to start, and that's single shutter release. So when I'm on S, it only takes one picture at a time, no matter how long I hold down the shutter button. So if I go like this, it only takes one. If I move to continuous low, CL, listen to what it sounds like. So it takes multiple pictures, and you just have to hold the shutter button down, but it's slower. If I do continuous high, CH, and I hold the shutter down, listen to this. So that's releasing the shutter a whole bunch. That's what you hear at like a sports game or an event or something, and someone's taking a lot of pictures because they want to capture something in the moment. That's perfect. That's what you want there. Then you have Q, which you'll never use, so I'm just going to skip it. You have this clock one. The clock one's nice because it's basically for if you want to, for instance, establish a timer because your family wants to take a picture and you want to be in that picture, you might use that. And then a remote is where you can actually hold an infrared remote and take a picture and release the shutter from like across the room or something, which is sometimes nice. That's also great if you're shooting at night and you don't want to cause the camera to jostle at all, which would ruin your picture. On the back now, you have a whole bunch of buttons. The main ones initially that you want to worry about are the play button here, which plays back your images so you can see what those look like. And then this button might be helpful, which is this info button down below. If you tap that info button, it actually tells you all of the settings you're currently on, which is also what you see through the viewfinder. You also have, obviously, menus. You can change all of your settings. You have a white balance button. You have an ISO button, which you're going to use that one a lot because you're going to want to set your ISO specifically. And then you have a quality, and that's just the size of the picture, effectively. Up in the top right, you have auto exposure lock and auto focus lock. That's really nice if in the moment you just want to lock something because you're shooting a whole bunch of pictures there. Then you have a live view, and if you rotate this little dial, it switches back and forth from live view. Be careful, unlike a cell phone, it will kill the battery really, really fast if you're on live view, especially if you're shooting. Then you have basically this control area, and this just allows you to move around menus and select OK. And then this L button is really, really important. It locks things. So oftentimes you want to just keep it in L locked, because otherwise what will happen is you'll actually move the area where you're focusing around. You'll accidentally move it and you won't intend to. On the side of the camera, we have where you insert your card, and on many of these you can actually use 2 memory cards, which is cool, and you can choose what to do with that second memory card. So sometimes it can just be like overflow, so let's say your first memory card got used up, then it'll start recording on the second. Otherwise, sometimes it's great to use for, on one of the cards it'll store RAW files, which we'll talk about later, and the other it'll just store normal JPEGs. On the other side of the camera, you have some more different inputs for different things. And again, most of these you won't ever use, but they're just there, and you can certainly Google them if you're interested in using them for whatever reason. I'm not trying to keep anything from you. You really use them, to be honest. And that's it. That's kind of your overview of the camera. There should be a name on your camera. That's the name of your camera for the year, so just stick with that name. This one's Mike. And then up in the top, we'll talk more about this in the future. This is a hot shoe. Hot shoes are used to oftentimes just kind of keep things on them. But sometimes like it'll be used for a flash because it can talk to the camera and it can create a synced flash. You do have an onboard flash. It's kind of junky, but if you push this little flash button on the side, then that flash will pop up. Or if you're in auto and it's dark, sometimes that flash will pop up when you hit the shutter. So if you don't want the flash to pop up, you can just change it to P, and that way the flash won't always pop up. That's about it. Again, if you lightly tap on the shutter, it's going to autofocus, and if you hold down the shutter, it's going to take that picture. So lightly tap to autofocus, hold down to shoot. I hope that helps. Just a little tour. There's so many buttons on a digital SLR, and of course the differences between Nikon, Canon, Sony, etc. Are just in the sense that they move the buttons around. Otherwise, the buttons kind of do the same stuff. So it's really good just to play around with it, try stuff out. Googling all the stuff works really well. So if you're not sure what it is, just Google it and you'll find a detailed overview, I'm sure, or a YouTube video or something like that.